Hello, my name is Amne and I am the director of the Unveiled Institute, which is a new think tank that's been created to sort of try and promote some respect and tolerance between different groups of people by undertaking some evidence-based policy analysis and assessment. Before I begin, I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land and Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders both past and present, and would also like to extend this respect to the Aboriginal people present today. I should probably also warn you that I've been losing my voice all day, so if that happens, don't worry, I've translated this into an interpretive dance and that's what we're all going to watch. So, it was September 2001 and I was 10, and like every other morning had woken up to have breakfast with my brothers. Of course we were arguing because my brothers decided to have the same cereal that I was having and that wasn't on. So we turned on the TV and we saw two buildings completely engulfed in smoke. We didn't exactly know what was happening, but we knew it was in America and we knew that a plane had hit the buildings. Over the next couple of days, I went from being like everyone else to being a Muslim, which apparently meant that I hated America and that meant I hated Australia as well. It was December 2001 and I was 10 and a half. My brother had finally made his own friends left me alone, but one of his friends came to tell me that a group of boys had cornered him and were about to beat him up. So of course, as the older sister, I ran over to see what was going on. The biggest of those kids was yelling things at my brother, and I walked in just as I heard him say, "We grew here, you flew here." My brother retaliated, "Well, you came in chains and we came on planes." The only problem with that is that my brothers and I were actually born here and so was Mum, so no one came on any planes. It was June 2004 and I was 13. I was waiting alone outside my school for my mum, who was uncharacteristically late from picking me up from debating practice, which I thought was really cool. A group of boys from the boys' school next door walked past me, and before I knew it, they were back. And before I knew what was going on, they'd attempted to rip my hijab off. Now, luckily for me, my hijab was pinned on really tightly, so it didn't go very far. But unfortunately for me, it was pinned on really tightly, which meant it really hurt when they did that. I didn't know who they were, but I wanted to dob them in. They were wearing the senior school uniform and they all had drawn their own Serbian flags on their backpacks, so I knew they could be identified pretty quickly if I wanted to. But I also knew that the boys' school next door didn't need an excuse to have a riot. Just the week before that, they had literally shaken the front gates of the school down because no one had opened the gates in time. So if they found out that a Muslim girl, who none of them knew, had been attacked by someone, they would kill each other. And so when my mum arrived a couple of minutes later, I got in the car and asked her what was for dinner. It was December 2005 and I was 14. 5,000 people poured onto the streets of Cronulla, chanting hate speech about the Lebs. They were armed with Australian flags and beating up anyone who looked remotely Lebanese. They were claiming their beach back. The problem was that that had been my beach too. I had spent every day of summer of my childhood in the waters of Cronulla. But suddenly, I was no longer able to see my beach friends because my family and I were no longer welcome there. It wasn't my beach anymore, just like this was not my country. It was May 2007 and I was 17. My dad and I were doing the rounds at parent-teacher interviews, and these were going to be really important because I was going to figure out what I'd study at uni. Now theoretically, the world was open to me. I was achieving an average of about 95% across all my subjects. I was doing 6 extras across maths and science and English and social sciences, so I could have really done anything I wanted to. The teachers told my dad that I was very well behaved and doing very, very well, but he needed to sit me down and make me reconsider my options for university because studying law and psychology would be a really, really bad idea. No one was going to take a hijabi girl seriously, and plus I'd probably just make a good school teacher. It was July 2010 and I was 19. I was on the train heading home from uni, and yet again a man I didn't know was calling me a terrorist and telling me to go back to where I came from. It wasn't the first time that I'd heard that, and it wasn't going to be the last time, so I just ignored him. Unfortunately this time, this man really didn't like it and lunged at me and took a swing at my head. Very luckily for me, another man actually intercepted him and they argued for a bit before this man shoved him off at the next train station. That was the last time I ever used a train. It was August 2011 and I was 20. A group of male students were raising money for the Syrian rebels who were going to take down the Assad regime. I asked them what the money would be used for and whether they had considered whether this money would go to dangerous sources. They told me I shouldn't be asking questions I didn't want to know the answer to, and of course I didn't let go, brought in that debating expertise. And within minutes, a mob of about 40 students from the Islamic Society had surrounded me, telling me that I was a disgraceful infidel who only said things to appease my white friends. I was a traitor and the reason why the Islamic Ummah was in shambles. It was December 2014 and I was 23. After looking after an international delegation at work, I received a series of text messages on my phone that I didn't want to look at. One of my staff came and pulled me out of the meeting to tell me that my mum was frantically looking for me. I called her to see what on earth was going on, and it turned out that the Link Cafe that I went to in Sydney was being held under siege by a man who had an ISIS flag. Mum wanted me to go home and stay safe. I told her that there was no way I was going to be able to do that today, and plus, why did I have to go home? I hadn't done anything, and why should I pay for it? She asked me whether any of us had ever done anything every other time an apparent Muslim had done something in our name. It was February 2016. I was 24. I had just successfully spent a year working as a very young assistant director in the public service after starting as a graduate less than 3 years before that. My new boss decided that those who had hired me for such a senior position were actually completely irresponsible. So she pulled me into a meeting with her new boss, and they said they were going to be talking to me about my work hours for half an hour. Instead, they spent the next hour and a half telling me that because of my culture, I was completely incapable of respecting women and their authority. Because of my culture, I didn't belong in this country and my behaviour needed to be modified. That despite the fact that I was born here, had only ever lived and worked in Australia, my practices needed to be amended to suit Australia. I had a mental breakdown that lasted for the last few months, and I spent time trying to pick up the very fragile pieces of a broken identity that I had spent years building. The unfortunate thing for me is it was only the month before that I had actually learnt to say out loud that I was Australian and really own it. But here I am again, not Lebanese enough to be Lebanese, not Australian enough to be Australian, and too Muslim to be tolerated. I haven't told you about the fact that when I travel with my brothers, we factor in search time for the random searches, or that, when I write a blog piece, I generally get death threats. My most favourite one was one where someone actually picked a plot in the Woden Cemetery and told me that they were going to bury me there. I haven't told you what it feels like when these messages in the media constantly etch away at your soul. And then I'm asked, Amne, why is it that Muslims who were raised in the West don't integrate to our way of life? Why is it that young Muslims don't contribute to society more? Well, anecdotally, we know that Muslims in this country have a really tough time. We know that racially motivated attacks against Muslim Australians increase after terrorist attacks. I know that being surrounded by this noise about your religion is enough to make you feel crazy, to make you feel like you will never belong. I know that being a good person that comes from a good family isn't enough to overcome that, because the messages that the media feeds us are very hard to comprehend. The part I really couldn't tell you is what it's done to our self-image, because I don't actually know. I've spent 2/3 of my life paying for 9/11 and every terrorist attack that came after that. I've spent 2/3 of my life explaining to people that I condemn acts of violence that I had nothing to do with. I have to tell people that I don't secretly share the feelings of these terrorists. Now, do I think that acts of violence committed by Muslims are justifiable? Of course not. But I think there is absolutely merit in understanding the underlying causes that drive someone to that sort of fringe, where they're able to justify extreme behaviour. Oh, God. So, look, I know that we all have our struggles, and I know that it's a natural part of human existence to question your identity and try and figure out who you are. When we start to peel away the layers of who we are when we're at work and who we are with our friends and what our feelings and opinions are, it's really hard to define ourselves. And I get that. But there is something to be said for growing up in a world that constantly tells you that you and everyone who shares your belief are the dangerous other. As a young Muslim, I grew up believing that the world was always going to treat me differently by default. The difference between me and a kid who ends up trying to actually plan a terrorist attack is that although the media told me I was an outsider, and my teachers told me I was an outsider, and the world in general told me I was an outsider, I had a dad who constantly reinforced the message that I was responsible for my own actions, that the opinions of others were not my business, and all I had to do was strive to be the absolute best version of myself. When we look at young Muslims in general, we have to remember that most of us are actually born to migrants who fled from war zones, migrants who need to learn the language and adapt to a new way of life. So not only are we dealing with generational differences, but we're trying to bridge a cultural divide with our own parents. You see children growing up in broken and confused families in low SES areas where teachers are completely ill-equipped to deal with the associated pressures. And when we have kids growing up in a world that's trying to tell them that who they are is based on the actions of others, we're bound to come across some very serious problems. To put this into perspective for you, kids who were born around 9/11 are actually 15 years old now. They've spent their whole lives processing the message that they're terrorists while trying to identify who they are as people and where they belong. They're in a world that is constantly feeding them the idea that they're not welcome anywhere. They've grown up in a world where the assumption is that if you're a young Muslim, you're likely to become radicalized unless someone intervenes. They're surrounded by de-radicalization and counter-extremism measures, programs costing literally hundreds of millions of dollars without having the right access to educational and mentoring materials because, well, there isn't enough money for that. Their politicians, their community leaders, and even former Dancing with the Stars hosts tell them that a wall should be built around their country to prevent people like them from entering it. So you have layer upon layer upon layer of pressure, which means that these kids don't trust their families, they don't trust their friends, they don't trust authority, they don't trust the schools, and most importantly, they don't even trust themselves. The reality is that we're actually raising a generation that doesn't feel like it's ever going to belong anywhere. When you leave disenfranchised and very frustrated youth unsupported, you open them up to becoming the targets of hate groups. The need to belong and the need for them to fulfill this sense of justice that they're looking for means that it's a much stronger driver than trying to be a peaceful person who figures out who they are. When they feel so isolated that they have nothing left to lose, then these hate groups become very tempting, especially when they can point to that night's racist news bulletin and say, see, you don't belong here, these aren't your people. They wage wars in our nations and then they tell us to go back there. And when we look at groups like ISIS, it's clear that all of this recent political instability has meant that there are power vacuums that allow them to grow and perpetuate this horrific message. They're receiving fundings from much wealthier individuals. The group is terrifying, yet somehow people leave the safety of the West to join them. Extremist movements are offering values, economic support and services. They're offering a sense of community, and that's very attractive in the face of persistent socioeconomic corruption, especially in the eyes of young people. So, does Islamophobia drive us into the clutches of extremists? Well, I don't think that's a question that I'm going to be able to answer, but I definitely know that that's not a question that I want to answer with the post-9/11 generation. All I know is that hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on countering violent extremism, and that money needs to be redistributed in a way that builds resilience and capacity within the Muslim community instead of ostracizing and alienating the youth. I look forward to hearing your opinions on all of this.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm losing my voice too, but maybe that's because I was so moved by your talk, Amne, as was someone else clearly. Okay, we now have do we have half an hour for questions, I think? Yeah. So I'm going to open up the floor. We'll take a couple at a time.
Amne, I thought that was the best presentation I've seen in a hell of a long time. Thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. I guess the question in my mind is, under this kind of pressure since 9/11, in your experience, and I guess I'd like others perhaps to comment on this as well, what are the pressures for young Muslims to de-identify as Muslims? I mean, do you have a sense of what the rate of the de-identification is, the desire just to kind of fit in and be non-controversial?
So I mean, in terms of actual data, part of the problem and part of the reason why this thing exists now is that it's really difficult to actually find data on the ground that demonstrates that. But I mean, personally, I tried to de-identify as a Muslim, which is really weird because I wore a headscarf at 11 to try and find an identity, yet somehow tried to de-identify. It was very confusing. But because my mum was born here, when people would ask me where I was from, it's a very loaded question, I could say, well, I was half Lebanese. And that made me feel like maybe they would connect to me. And the unfortunate thing was that people did sort of feed that message that if I was one of them, then it was okay. And I know far too many Muslim women who have taken off their headscarves once they've become successful because they just find it really, really difficult to deal with all of the pressure and this idea that they're representative of the entire community, so they just take it off. It's a really tricky one. I struggle with it a lot. I've kind of made a pledge to myself that no matter what happens, I'm not taking my hijab off, just so that the young girls who were in my position when I was their age can look to someone who's actually still successful, relatively successful, without taking away their identity.
Could I just say that I clearly don't know the answer to that, but just to point out that the re-identification with Islam among young Muslims is certainly increasing.
That's true.
Channel 4 in the UK commissioned from a very reputable source, and it was just broadcast and reported in April. It's called What British Muslims Really Think. And you probably have seen, you probably have seen this. There's no hesitation. There's no embarrassment. There's no sense that we need to defer to the larger norms of society. This is it. What do we think about homosexuality? 52% should be illegal. Should you have lesbian and gay teachers? Overwhelmingly, no. Should there be polygamy? 35% yes. And these are all Muslim youth. Now, this is a very striking development, and I think it's very interesting. And I'm stating it neutrally. It's up to you to decide whether it's good or bad. But I do notice that the larger society has drawn entirely negative conclusions from it. So the former head of the director of the Commission for Racial Equality, Trevor Phillips, said this is the man who started the Islamophobia sort of trend. In 1997, he commissioned the first report. They coined the term Islamophobia. He has now written and broadcast since April saying, we were wrong. We were too sensitive about Muslims. In fact, look, they're distancing themselves from our society. They are becoming a nation within a nation, quote unquote. So the conclusion of to the extent that there is a re-identification with Islam, the conclusion of the larger society is of hostility. So it's compounding the problem rather than answering it.
Yeah. And I guess to add to that, in Canberra at the moment, I'm part of a group of young people who see all of this and then say, well, this doesn't actually reflect what we know to be true. And so what we're trying to do is figure out why on earth these studies are saying that we're re-identifying when we know anecdotally that we're de-identifying. And what we've found is, for the most part, we all put on this facade of extreme Muslimness when we're around other Muslims because we don't want to feel ostracized. We don't want people to think that not only do we not belong in Australia, but we don't belong in that group. So whether I would be able to find data that supports that more broadly, I don't know. But I think this is part of the problem with these studies when they're so far removed from all of these layers of complexity. We come up with conclusions, and whether they're good or bad, I don't know, but we come up with conclusions that aren't mimicking what we know to be true.
Interesting.
I think there's also, but the pressure to perform the role of the moderate Muslim, and then the counter pressure of not being seen as conforming to the role of the moderate Muslim. And when you're talking about headscarves and wanting to take off, because there are women who wish to remove their headscarf, not having ever worn a headscarf, and which I never have, and also coming from South Asian rather than being identified by others as being of South Asian rather than Arab background. There's not that same kind of, it's a different dynamic. But to remove it, which is seen as being, well, a dilution of religious identity as well as a succumbing to pressure from outside. But yeah, when that's not the motive for a lot of women, and which also we haven't contested. I mean, we've contested the narrative that says it's about women being forced to do it. We meaning within Muslim and women who wear hijab and women who don't. We haven't so much contested this place that it's taken as a signifier of Muslim authenticity. That you're more of a Muslim woman if you wear it than if you don't. Even though women who wear it and women who don't likewise will say that it's problematic, but we haven't taken that up so much.
That's true.
And and so that it's become a difficult environment for us to have conversations among ourselves. Also because of that sense that we're always being watched, and that what we say here among ourselves will be appropriated, and if we start questioning some trends, the next thing you know is going to be on the front page of the Daily Telegraph.
We've got a question in the middle there. I've got one here. Sorry, Selena.
No, that's all right. All the three presentations were great, but Amne, I was just interested in finding out when that public service position, you were called in and told that, your reaction was you had a nervous breakdown.
That's right.
Did you take it up to the discrimination officer and say,
Yeah.
I'm an Australian citizen, I don't put up with this?
Yeah.
What is it that young people, and not so young, find it hard to own their Australian identity, their rights as citizens, to say the rules are the same and we don't play by a different rule?
Yeah.
So I'd just be interested in your...
Sure. Okay. So I think the reason why I had a mental breakdown was because I grew up in Western Sydney. Move this close, okay. I grew up in Western Sydney where all of us didn't feel like we belonged. Like even the Australians, born Anglo-Saxon students didn't feel like they belonged. So, oi! So when I came to Canberra, I felt like I was in a different environment, and I'd spent a couple of years sort of being surrounded by people who said, no, you're Australian. It's like, oh, yeah, I'm Australian. So when this happened, and because it was in such a personal place, like I'd worked as a consultant around the federal police and I'd received death threats, and that didn't hurt me as much. I think it was having it be so close and with people who I trusted. I found it really, really hard. So I didn't want to report anything because I just thought to myself, it's a meeting, I have no record of this, no one was there, there's 2 against 1, what's the point? And in fact, my staff were the ones who sent me the bullying and harassment forms and said, you absolutely, if you can't do this and you're talking on behalf of the community, then what chance does anyone else have? So I put in a harassment claim and told the department I want nothing done about it, and they were the ones who said, no, we absolutely have to do something. They brought in an external investigator who investigated my claims. Amazingly, the 2 idiots admitted to what they said and to more things that I'd forgotten. So as per all procedures, I don't actually know what happened to them in the end. I was moved, I went to a different team and sort of pulled it together. I guess the great thing for me is that there were 2 horribly racist people, and if I pulled together the team that helped me in this, there were at least 60 people within the next 2 days who were supporting me. And so for me, when I talk to young Muslims about this, that's what I say, that, although it feels like you can't say anything, you absolutely should, because someone will always look to this and say, this is ridiculous and this is unfair. So, I think I've done a pretty good job at recovering. Every now and then I get a really weird urge to run away because I suddenly feel like no one wants me. But for the most part, I was very, very well supported.
It deserved the media exposure that we're accusing everybody of being so negative about on the other side of the coin.
That's right.
That didn't make it into the national media.
That's right.
Did
Yeah.
not provoke
Yeah.
the consciences of people.
No, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Can I just ask you a slightly procedural question about that?
Yeah.
Did you find the whole investigative process empowering or disempowering? Because it strikes me that can be the crucial point
Yeah.
whether or not this works.
Yeah.
Whether you've not so much the justice, but being
Yeah.
listened to and empowered through that.
Yeah, I think the department tried to make me feel empowered by bringing an external person who they paid a lot of money for. To be honest, when to be honest, when I walked into the building to have my interview, I was actually ready to physically run away. And one of my colleagues was there as a support person, and he literally had to grab me and say, "You're going in and doing this." I found it really embarrassing to sit and cry and tell this person I'd never met that all these horrible things had happened, because all I could think about was, well, there are people who are really suffering in the world, and a bunch of people just said some dumb things to me and I'm not coping, and that's not okay. I think now that it's all over, so the actual process, the answer really quickly, the actual process was not empowering at all. But now that it's all over and I've moved away, I feel like what I can take from that is the empowering part, the fact that I can tell young people that there are avenues to pursue. That's what's empowering about it all. Yeah.
Okay, yes, there's a lady in the middle there. Been very patient.
Thanks very much.
It's just cosmetic.
Okay. Yeah, I just noticed quite a lot of you made comments at different stages about I don't have evidence for this, or I couldn't, say this because I lack evidence. I just interesting. Last night was a lecture on called "The Value of the Arts and Humanities," and it's really disputing that method. That the scientific method of reporting what's going on in a deeply, emotional, thing about a space that's about values and emotions, that we seem to feel that when we talk about it we have to refer to hard evidence, and that's I'm doing research in climate framing, and the climate research in that area of framing says that actually data and evidence, it's not about that, it's about we need to use artistic methods, and so I just want to validate how your story, the power of your story is far more powerful than all these, other approaches. So I was just wondering if any of you knew about how, or had thoughts about how we can approach this in a way that connects with people more, and perhaps, move away from some of these scientific, rational methods of discussing the issue that might be holding us back from having the dialogue that we need to have.
Yeah. Do you guys want to answer first? I feel like I'm hogging all of this.
The only thing I would say is that it was clear, I think, from what I was saying, that the supposed scientific method doesn't take us very far. So you're right. It can identify, I think, connections. It can identify trends, but it's not going to answer the questions of causality, which everybody is reaching for. And so we are left, what I think worries those of us who sort of have professionalized this subject, is that the power of the individual story is important and overwhelming, but it might seem anecdotal. And so does it therefore, how representative is it, becomes a question. Now, that of course doesn't mean anything when it comes down to an individual's life. But in terms of, I think, in terms of trying to distill from that social policy, then there probably is incumbent upon people to try to think about the larger picture.
I'd just say, this arts and humanities professor would say that's a hierarchical view of knowledge, that view that the story has no value, but we know that books like Uncle Tom's Cabin and other books
Sure.
that have enormous influence, and that it's the hierarchy of devaluing a different form of conveying knowledge and understanding.
But that was a book, it had enormous impact, and I wouldn't dispute that, I don't think anybody would, but we're talking about stories, whether they show it doesn't mean, and I'm not saying that it didn't, but you wouldn't look at Uncle Tom's Cabin and says, it struck a particular note, but you wouldn't look at it necessarily for data about what slavery was like. In fact, it's been criticised from that point of view. So I think there's a different purposes of stories.
Yeah.
I started out mine with talking about how I wondered whether I was getting a distorted view. That's partly just a self-critical question I think is useful to ask from time to time. Partly also because one of the major researchers on Muslim attitudes. Kevin Dunn, I sat through a paper of his where he was talking about work of colleagues in the field overall and saying that we had been, whether Muslims in Australia were feeling, I disagreed with him on this, by the way, but he was criticising researchers for focusing on selected groups when in coming to the conclusion that Muslims in Australia were feeling, disaffected, and he said using quantitative data he had come to a different conclusion. As I said, I quite vocally, actually, during the discussion period, disagreed with him on that, but at the same time I take a step back now and again and ask myself, am I just not taking in the full picture? Am I exaggerating the scale of something by looking at, by taking too narrow a snapshot, and by losing myself too much in one particular trend?
I think you're onto something, which is exactly why I've refused to work with any other organisation to work for them. I work with them, but I don't work for them anymore, because I'm sick of seeing data that doesn't reflect reality. I'm sick of seeing policies that don't come up with actual solutions, that do nothing to help the people that they're purporting to help. My day job is, I'm a policy analyst. That's what I do, and writing government policy is what I've become an expert as, which is why I'm trying to take those professional skills and bring them into something that's very personal for me. But the honest answer is, if I don't have data to demonstrate what's going on, no one is going to give me money to run my projects, and that is what we're dealing with. So at the moment I have 25 volunteers who have day jobs, who have families, who are studying, who are then spending nights in my living room doing really hardcore policy analysis. And unless we can show that there's a tangible difference with the papers that we're writing, no one's going to care or hear us out at all.
I'll just add that Kevin Dunn would say that 25 is not nearly enough, and I would disagree with him.
Oh, well,
to say,
if anyone else wants to come work with me, come see me, but I have 25 now.
I think 25 is fine, but I'm just noting that, that there's critiques that can come from a number of directions.
Can I just jump in there? Autoethnography and radicalisation from sociology is becoming a little bit more acceptable in terms of
Autoethnography and sociology. Your story, for example, would be a prime candidate for something like that, where you can then draw in the literature and it will spur people on and give them the basis. So they're the types of things that, congratulations on the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Build on that quite well, I would imagine.
Thank you.
Next, other questions?
No one else is. Can I have a follow-up if no one else is putting their hands up?
This is not my field, so excuse me if this is a naive question, but I wonder whether part of what's happening is not so much about Muslims and Islamophobia, but about aggressive secularism and a sense of, I think one of the things that has developed, I guess since 9/11 or perhaps before it, is what I would call an aggressive secularism, a willingness of high-profile commentators, people like Richard Dawkins, who are prepared to argue very aggressively about the illegitimacy of all religion, and whether there is an underlying current of that some of the hostility that Muslims feel, obviously there's a big part of it which is tied to the kind of terrorist trope, but I wonder whether there's an undercurrent of this kind of aggressive secularism behind. I don't know if you've experienced that at all.
Could I take that one up?
Sure.
Okay, I think secularism, like feminism, is a value that I identify with that has been appropriated by, and I would say misused by those kinds of aggressive voices. Again, there's different definitions of secularism. Looking around quite a lot of South Asian faces. In South Asia, it's used in a different sense to, of course, even within Europe, there's French definitions quite different to the Anglo-American or Australian definition of secularism. And in South Asia, also, it's been about managing what in South Asia is called communalism, conflict between religious communities. It isn't about removing religion from the public space. It's about preventing conflict in that sense. And so, like, having primarily heard. So yeah, no, I do describe myself as being secularist according to that definition of it, just as I describe myself as being feminist, but not in the sense of the women holding up the sign about you keep your clitoris, you keep your burqa, I'll keep my clitoris. I think it's useful to know that. I would agree, though, with it being used in that way, but I would say that it's a particular form of neo-atheism is more problematic. This sort of Dawkins-esque, which is not, which is also quite anti-woman. There have been various quite ugly conflicts between high-profile atheist men, Dawkins among them, and women from within their own movement who critiqued this sort of misogyny within the movement, and which I won't go into here. But yeah, I wouldn't describe, I think you're onto something, so I wouldn't call it secularism, I'd call it a particular type of atheism.
Could I disagree? I think there's there's an intellectual secular elite, but it's an elite. The story of the world is the growth of religious sentiment, whether it's Christian fundamentalism, Hinduism, Islam, etc. That's the story of the world. And I think that it is indeed true there are people like Dawkins, etc., but that's basically an elite response. If you want to characterize what's happening today, I would say it's the rise of affiliation with religion, and that becomes a public matter, not just a private matter.
I'm going to
wouldn't
slightly
disagree with
agree
that.
and slightly disagree with both. So, just to make it cool. So I think like James has said, the idea of secularism being the problem doesn't work for me because it's far too intellectual for most people. Not to say that people couldn't engage with that, but most people don't care. So if Dawkins speaks, they're just like, whatever, he's some spaceman, right? Like, they don't care. The problem that I'm seeing is this sort of movement towards right-wing nationalism, and that's where the problem is. So you have all of these people coming into new countries, people don't know what to do with them, people don't know how to deal with it, and suddenly they want to maintain their identity. And so rather than worrying about people's religions, it just becomes you are the other, whether that's your religion or the way you look or whatever's going on. And you can see it around the world. I mean, the fact that we have Trump, the fact that Brexit happened, all of these things are on the rise everywhere. How we deal with them, I'm not quite sure. I'm hoping my policy research will come up with some recommendations that are actually useful. But how you convince a bunch of people not to run around with Australian flags screaming really racist things, I don't know. Give them some kebabs, I don't know, halal snack packs, I don't know.
Yes, the lady in the back there. Get your microphone.
Yeah, I can speak up. I have a very general question. Where do you see the room for dialogue in society clearly needed as society? I think personally, I'm from the Netherlands, so I see what is happening in Europe and how also in the Netherlands exactly the same thing is happening with Geert Wilders, like here with Pauline Hanson and whatever. But I feel like we're all talking about these different groups as if they are already groups, whereas I feel like society is also strongly still this individualistic community. So where would you see a constructive dialogue in order to overcome all these different stereotypes that we're actually creating right now?
Yeah. So you said which room? At the moment it's my living room. So like I genuinely, legitimately invite anyone to come and sit with me and chat with me. So I have so many examples. So my logo was designed by someone I met online who was a racist who hated me. And we started talking, and he was very confused about my existence. And then he decided I was really cool, and then he was even more confused. And now we're friends. I helped him go to uni, and I helped him do a whole bunch of things. So when I was looking for a graphic designer, he asked if he could do it for me. My living room during Ramadan, which was the holy Islamic month where people fast, becomes a place where people come and have dinner with me, and I will cook banquets for 30 people at a time in my one-bedroom apartment and have them there just so they can ask whatever questions. I make a point of responding to every disgusting email I get from people because I feel like a lot of the time people don't recognize what they're saying. Not to say that people are stupid, but they don't even know what they're upset about. So one guy, for example, wrote me an email, and the subject was, oh God, can I swear? Would that offend anyone? Okay, it was fuck you, comma, bitch, full stop. And I thought, clearly you're really good at this whole grammar thing. You can't be that much of an idiot. So he had written all of this crazy stuff about how, like, the Japanese used to be proud, but then we bombed them, and now look at them, they're great, and we should do that to the Middle East, whatever. So my email, I was kind of like, oh God, how do I... Dear so-and-so, your grammar is great. Let's go through these points that you've raised. And I responded to everything he said, and we talked for 10 months. Eventually, the second last email I got from him said, can you please change the subject next time you send me an email, because I'm starting to feel really bad. So I think what needs to happen is there need to be more people who are willing to just sit there and cop it and say, okay, you're probably going to be really disgusting to begin with, but that doesn't affect who I am. I'm just going to let you get it out. And then you have to be willing to listen to me. And people like to say, well, that's never going to happen. It happens. It happens in my house all the time. It happens in my inbox all the time. It's a thing.
I'm going to come in there and say, one of the pieces which I am now in the wake of the federal election, not changing direction but updating, is the theme of it is like picnics versus protests, which has been conversations about how to respond to, as I said, reclaim. And Brad Chilcott from the Welcome to Australia and others, and you would be with the picnic camp.
That's right.
And
I don't do protests ever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you can do both, because I do think it's picnics are not hazard free. And I'm going to show my age here. I'm going to show my age here and say I did a lot of picnicking immediately post Cronulla. We've kind of been there, and maybe it's just like saturation point. And I personally have, like, they bring these stories which have value and which are important. And I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing. I'm not trying to talk you out of it. And then have stories like that to tell from it. But yeah, I think that the majority of, again with the hazards about statistics, but I think that a lot of the time the people who you meet are not the ones who hearts and minds you win over, even though there's, which started out very aggressive, we're not really the ones that pose that much of a threat to us in the first place. On the whole, it just seems to be, maybe I'm just dispirited from, and they can be really enriching experiences for the people who are concerned for them, and they have value in that regard. And some close friendships, which I still value, have arisen out of there. And I'm not going to stop going to the picnics, don't get me wrong, halal food and all. But I think it's not so much that I think that picnics don't have value and the picnicking approach doesn't have value and isn't useful, or that we should stop doing it, but that we've seen a lot of it since Hansen, this talk about, we need to understand racists and understand the source of their disaffection, and Ali's piece last week about forgiveness to Sonia Kruger, which got quite a lot of articles and blog posts from young Muslims going, no. I disagreed with him too. Yeah, quite. Yeah. There's just limits to that, because picnics, when they're used, and like Brad Chilcott wrote in response to the scenes in Fed Square with Reclaim, that delegitimise protests, that's dangerous. That picnics in a way of sort of, this is healthy. Picnics in a way that get deployed, bad Muslim, good Muslim. Good Muslims go to picnics. Good Muslims go and understand racists and make friends with them and win their hearts and minds. Bad Muslims, on the other hand, get angry and protest, and they might as well be joining ISIS when they're taking such an aggro attitude to Islamophobia. So
but I don't think it's about forgiving them or even legitimising the concerns. It's about saying, I'm here. No, I know. It's about saying, I'm here and I'm a person, and if you want to be a racist, disgusting pig, do it to my face. Like, that's what it's about for me. So if you can't do it to my face, then clearly you don't know what you're upset about. And even if you can do it to my face, then I'm here to give you a response to what your concerns are. Now, some of these people are crazy. seriously. And there's nothing that you can do to fix them because they don't want to know what the solutions are. They're just angry at someone, and so they're going to make you pay for it. But for the most part, if I sit behind my wall and they sit behind their wall, there's absolutely nothing that's going to happen. And my problem is I grew up in a society that told me sit behind the wall because it's safer. And I'm done with that, and I'm tired of feeling like a victim. So let's sit on the other side of the wall and see what happens.
Were there any other last pressing questions, or that was one last question? Okay, the lady down there.
Amne, my question is to you, and the reason I'm asking this question is because you work with young Muslims.
Yeah.
And among Muslims there is a lot of diversity which generally is painted like that. And young people with whom you work who identify themselves as Muslims, particularly women who don't cover their head, what kind of issues they bring that trouble them about their identity? I'm asking this question because I'm a mother of a teenager. I don't cover my head and she doesn't do that too.
Yeah.
And many times because she does not cover her head, she is told that she is not a good Muslim
Yes.
or she's not a Muslim at all.
That's right.
Because this is how Muslims are identified.
Yep.
And because you work with those young people who come from that diverse background, what kind of issues that they have in the bigger picture in which you work?
Yep. So I'm going to broaden that out to not just Muslim women who don't wear a hijab, gay Muslims, Muslims who are divorced, Muslims who converted from another culture, another religion. It's broad. Most Muslims are not, the hijabi, nice Muslim who looks like they pray 5 times a day and fast. And the problem is we all feel like our elders are expecting us to be that, and so we put on that facade. So when we have our get-togethers and we have these discussions, so one person, for example, is a world champion boxer. She doesn't wear a hijab. She doesn't feel like she's accepted as a Muslim, and so her problem is that not only does she not belong here, but she doesn't even start to belong in an Islamic community. And so she feels like a complete outsider because she doesn't want to have no ethnic connection, but she also can't have one because we won't let her. My gay Muslim friends are in the same situation. They feel like they're not allowed to own this identity of being Muslim. So although they'll try to go to the mosque, they'll be rejected. And so they end up going down this path of, I'll connect to the gay identity more. And so they're living in Surrey Hills and do the whole clubbing thing because that gives them a sense of connection. So for them, it's just this confusion about who they are. That's far worse than anything I've ever experienced because I cheated and put this on and now I belong and no one knows what's going on underneath. So their issues are very similar but also different in the sense that if we don't, we look at Orlando and what happened there. If we don't make people feel like they're allowed to be whoever they want to be while also believing in a spiritual being that none of us can kind of prove exists, we're going to keep having these problems.
I got the boxer because my book launch in Melbourne was interrupted by a noisy anti-Muslim racist. When I had the event in Canberra with Bianca.
That's the one!
Because I knew Bianca and because I knew she'd have good things to say. But I was also hoped that the poster of Bianca in her boxing gloves would deter any anti-Muslim racists for turning up and disrupting it the way they had in Melbourne. It wasn't my reason, but I thought that's a bonus side effect potentially.
But she's so sweet, she would never box anyone.
I know, but they don't know that.
On that note, I think I'll end what was an incredible session. They just keep getting better and better. I'd like to thank all our speakers for such a raw and real presentation today. Thank you very much.